Letter 16, dated at Missilimakinak, May 28, 1689, containing an account of the author's departure from and return to Missilimakinak, a description of the Bay of Puants and its villages, an ample description of the Beavers, followed by the journal of a remarkable voyage upon the long river and a map of the adjacent country. Sir, thank God, I am now returned from my voyage upon the long river, which falls into the river of Mississippi. I would willingly have traced it up to its source, if several obstacles had not stood in my way. I set out from hence the 24th of September, accompanied with my own detachment, and the 5 huntsmen I mentioned in my last, who indeed did me a great deal of service. All the soldiers were provided with new canoes, loaded with provisions and ammunition, and such commodities as are proper for the savages. The wind, which stood then in the north, wafted me in 3 days to the bay of Potawatamis, that lay 40 leagues off. The mouth of that bay is in a manner choked with isles, and the bay itself is 10 leagues broad and 25 leagues long. The 29th, we came to a little deep sort of a river, which disembarges at the place where the water of the lake swells 3 foot high in 12 hours, and decreases as much in the same compass of time. Our tarrying there 3 or 4 days gave me an opportunity of making this remark. The villages of the Sakis, the Potawatamis, and some Malominis are seated on the side of that river, and the Jesuits have a house or college built upon it. This is a place of great trade for skins and Indian corn, which these savages sell to the coureurs de bois as they come and go, it being the nearest and most convenient passage to the river of Mississippi. The soil of this country is so fertile that it produces, in a manner without agriculture, our European corn, peas, beans, and several other fruits that are not known in France. As soon as I landed, the warriors of these 3 nations came by turns to my apartment to regale me with the calumet dance and with the captain's dance, the former being a signification of peace and friendship, and the latter of respect and esteem. I returned the compliment with a present of some rolls of Brazil tobacco, which they value mightily, and some strings of Venice beads, with which they embroider their coats. Next morning I was invited to a feast with one of the 3 nations, and after having sent to him some dishes and plates, pursuant to the custom of the country, I went accordingly about noon. They began with congratulating my arrival, and after I had returned them thanks, fell a singing and dancing one after another, in a particular manner, of which you may expect a circumstantial account when I have more leisure. The singing and dancing lasted for 2 hours, being seasoned with acclamations of joy and jests, which make up part of their ridiculous music. After that, the slaves came to serve, and all the company sat down after the Eastern fashion, every one being provided with his mess, just as our monks are in the monastery halls. First off, all 4 platters were set down before me, in the first of which there were 2 white fish only boiled in water, in the second the tongue and breast of a roebuck boiled, in the third 2 wood hens, the hind feet or trotters of a bear, and the tail of a beaver, all roasted, and the fourth contained a large quantity of broth made of several sorts of meat. For drink they gave me a very pleasant liquor, which was nothing but a syrup of maple beat up with water, but of this more elsewhere. The feast lasted 2 hours, after which I entreated one of the grandees to sing for me, for in all the ceremonies made use of amongst the savages, 'tis customary to employ another to act for him. I made this grandee a present of some pieces of tobacco, in order to oblige him to act my part till night. Next day and the day after I was obliged to go to the feasts of the other 2 nations, who observed the same formalities. The most curious thing I saw in the villages was 10 or 12 tame beavers, that went and came like dogs from the rivers to the cottages, without straggling out of the road. I asked the savages if these animals could live out of the water, and received this answer, that they could live ashore as well as dogs, and that they had kept some of them above a year without suffering them to go near the rivers, from whence I conclude that the casuists are out in not ranging ducks, geese, and teals in the number of amphibious animals, as the naturalists are wont to do. I had heard the same story from several Americans before, but being apprehensive that there were different species of beavers, I had a mind to be better informed. And indeed there is a particular kind of them, which the savages call the terrestrial or land beaver. But at the same time they tell you these are of a different species from the amphibious sort, for they make holes or dens in the earth, like rabbits or foxes, and never go near the water unless it be to drink. They are likewise called by the savages the lazy or idle kind, as being expelled by the other beavers from the canals in which these animals are lodged, to the number of 80. These canals I mean to describe afterwards. In the meantime I only take occasion to acquaint you that the idle sort, being unwilling to work, are expelled by the others, just as wasps are by bees, and are so teased by them that they are forced to quit the canals, which the better and more industrious race hurdles up to themselves in defense. This supine beaver resembles the other sort in its figure, excepting that the hair is rubbed off the back and the belly, which is occasioned by their rubbing against the earth when they return to or steer out from their holes. The writers of natural history are very much out in fancying that the beavers cut off their own testicles when pursued by the huntsman, for that which the physicians call castoreum is not lodged in the testicles, but in a certain bag that nature seems to have formed on purpose for these animals, and this bag they may use of to clear their teeth after the biting of some gummy shrub. But supposing the testicles to be the proper receptacle of the castor, we must still conceive that 'tis impossible for a beaver to pull out his testicles without rendering the nerves of the groin, in which they are seated just by the share bone. 'Tis manifest that Elian and several other naturalists were scarce acquainted with beaver hunting, for had they known anything of the matter, they would have never have talked of the pursuing of these animals, which never go from the side of the pond where their canals are built, and which dive under water upon the least noise, and return to their dens when the danger is over. If these creatures were but sensible of the reason for which war is declared against them, they would flee themselves alive, for 'tis their skin only that the huntsmen want, the value of the castor being nothing in comparison with that. A great beaver is 26 inches long, from the hind head to the root of the tail. 'Tis about 3 foot and 8 inches round. Its head is 7 inches long and 6 broad. Its tail is 14 inches long and 6 broad, and about the middle of it has the thickness of an inch and 2 lines. The figure of the tail is oval, the scale with which 'tis covered and which performs the office of what the physicians call the epidermis or scarf skin, is an irregular hexagon. The beaver carries upon its tail the clay, the earth, and other materials of which they make their banks and canals or huts by a wonderful instinct. Its ears are short, round, and hollow. Its legs are 5 inches long, its feet 6 inches and 8 lines, and its paws are 3 inches and a half from the heel to the end of the great toe. Its paws are formed much like a man's hand, and they make use of them in feeding, as apes do. The 5 toes are joined like those of a duck, with a membrane of a slate color. Its eyes are of the lesser size, in proportion to the bulk of its body, and bear the figure of a rat's eyes. Before its muzzle, there are 4 foreteeth or cutters, 2 in each jaw, as in a rabbit, besides which it has 16 grinders, that is, 8 in the upper and as many in the lower mandible. The cutters are above an inch long and a quarter of an inch broad, being very strong and sharp, like a cutlass, for a beaver assisted by its associates, if I may so call its fellow beavers, cuts down trees as big as a hogshead, which I could never have believed if I had not observed with my own eyes above 20 trunks of trees cut down in that fashion. A beaver has 2 lays of hair. One is long and of a shining black color, with a grain as big as that of man's hair. The other is fine and smooth, and in winter 15 lines long. In a word, the last is the finest down in the world. The skin of such a beaver, as I have now described, will be 2 pound weight, but the price varies according to the goodness. In winter and autumn, the flesh of a beaver eats very well if it be roasted. Thus, sir, I have presented you with an exact description of these reputed amphibious animals, which make such structures that all the art of man can scarce equal. Upon another occasion, perhaps, I may give you a circumstantial account of their wonderful structure, which I decline at present because the digression would be too tedious. To return to my voyage. After our arrival in the Bay of Pontewatamis, we bid adieu to the navigation upon the lakes of Canada, and setting out September 30, arrived October 2 at the foot of the fall of Kakalin, after stemming some little currents in the river of Puants. The next day we accomplished the small land carriage, and on the 5th arrived before the village of Kikapus, in the neighborhood of which I encamped the next day in order to receive intelligence. That village stands upon the brink of a little lake, in which the savages fish great quantities of pikes and gudgeons. I found only 30 or 40 men fit for war in the place, for the rest were gone a beaver hunting some days before. The 7th I embarked, and rowing hard made in the evening the little lake of Malominis, where we killed bucks and bustards enough for supper. We went ashore that night, and built huts for ourselves upon a point of land that shoots out. By break of day I went in a canoe to the village, and after an hour's conference with some of the savages, presented them with 2 rolls of tobacco, and they, by way of acknowledgement, made me a present of 2 or 3 sacks of oatmeal, for the sides of the lake are covered with a sort of oats, which grow in tufts, with a tall stalk, and of which the savages reap plentiful crops. The 9th I arrived at the foot of Outagami's fort, where I found but few people. However, they gave me a very kind reception, for after dancing the calumet before the door of my hut, they made me a present of venison and fish. Next day they conveyed me up the river, to the place where their folks were hunting the beavers. The 11th we embarked and landed the 13th upon the shore of a little lake, where the head of that nation resided. After we had reared up our huts, the general gave me a visit, and inquired which way I intended to move. I made answer that I was so far from designing to march towards the Nadeuasias, his enemies, that I should not come near them by 100 leagues, and to confirm the innocence of my intentions, I prayed him to send 6 warriors to accompany me to the long river, which I designed to trace up to its source. He replied that he was extreme glad to find that I carried neither arms nor clothes to the Nadeuasias, that he saw I had not the equipage of a coureur de bois, but that on the contrary, I had some discovery in my view. At the same time, he cautioned me not to venture too far up that noble river, by reason of the multitudes of people that I would find there, though they have no stomach for war. He meaned that some numerous party might surprise me in the night time. In the meantime, instead of the 6 warriors that I desired, he gave me 10, who understood the lingua, and knew the country of the Eocoros, with whom his nation had maintained a peace of 20 years standing. I stayed 2 days with this general, during which time he regaled me nobly, and walked about with me to give me the satisfaction of observing the disposure of the cottages of the beaver hunters, a description of which you may expect in another place. I presented him with a fuse, 12 flintstones, 2 pounds of powder, 4 pounds of ball, and a little axe, and I gave each of his 2 sons a great coat and a roll of Brazil tobacco. 2 of the 10 warriors that he gave me could speak the language of the Ottawas, which I was well pleased with. Not that I was a stranger to their own language, for between that and the Algonquin there is no great difference, but in regard that there were several words that puzzled me. My 4 Ottawas were transported with this little reinforcement, and were then so encouraged that they told me above 4 times that we might venture safely so far as the plantation of the Sun. I embarked with this small guard the 16th about noon, and arrived that night at the land carriage of Wisconsin, which we finished in 2 days. That is, we left the river of Puants and transported our canoes and baggage to the river Wisconsin, which is not above 3/4 of a league distant or thereabouts. I shall say nothing of the river we left, but that was muddy, full of shelves, and enclosed with a steep coast, marshes, and frightful rocks. The 19th we embarked upon the river Wisconsin, and being favored by a slack current, arrived in 4 days at the place, where it empties itself into the river Mississippi, which is about half a league broad in that part. The force of the current and the breadth of that river is much the same as that of the Loire. It lies northeast and southwest, and its sides are adorned with meadows, lofty trees, and firs. I observed but 2 islands upon it, though there may be more, which the darkness of the night hid from us as we came down. The 23rd we landed upon an island in the river Mississippi, over against the river I spoke of but now, and were in hopes to find some wild goats there, but had the ill fortune to find none. The day after we crossed to the other side of the river, sounding it everywhere, as we had done the day before, and found 9-foot water in the shallowest place. The 2nd of November we made the mouth of the long river, having first stemmed several rapid currents of that river, though 'twas then at lowest ebb. In this little passage we killed several wild beavies, which we broiled, and catched several large dabs. On the 3rd we entered the mouth of the long river, which looks like a lake full of bulrushes. We found in the middle of it a narrow channel, upon which we steered till night, and then lay by to sleep in our canoes. In the morning I inquired of my 10 Outagamis if we had far to sail before we were clear of the rushes, and received this answer, that they had never been in the mouth of that river before, though at the same time they assured me that about 20 leagues higher the banks of it were clad with woods and meadows. But after all we did not sail so far, for about 10 o'clock next morning the river came pretty narrow, and the shore was covered with lofty trees, and after continuing our course the rest of that day we had a prospect of meadows now and then. That same night we landed at a point of land with a design to dress our broiled meat, for at that time we had none fresh. The next day we stopped at the first island we saw, in which we found neither man nor beast, and the evening drawing near I was unwilling to venture far into it, so we even contented ourselves with the catching of some sorry fish. The 6th a gentle gale sprung up, which wafted us to another island about 12 leagues higher, where we landed. Our passage to this place was very quick, notwithstanding the great calm that always prevails upon this river, which I take to be the least rapid river in the world. But the quickness of the passage was not the only surprisal, for I was amazed that I saw no harts, nor bucks, nor turkeys, having met with them all along in the other parts of my discovery. The 7th, the same wind drove us to a 3rd island, that lay 10 or 12 leagues off the former, which we quitted in the morning. In this 3rd island our savages killed 30 or 40 pheasants, which I was not ill pleased with. The 8th, the wind proving unserviceable to us, by reason that 'twas intercepted by hills covered with firs. We plied our oars, and about 2 in the afternoon descried on the left hand large meadows, and some huts at the distance of 1/4 of a league from the river. Upon this discovery, our savages and 10 of the soldiers jumped upon the shore, and directed their course to the houses, where they found 50 or 60 huntsmen prepared to receive them with their bows and arrows. As soon as the huntsmen heard the voice of the Otogamis, they threw down their arms and presented the company with some deer that they had just killed, which they likewise helped to carry to my canoes. The benefactors were some of the Eukoros, who had left their villages and come thither to hunt. I presented them more out of policy than acknowledgement, with tobacco, knives, and needles, which they could not but admire. Upon this, they repaired with expedition to their villages, and gave their associates to understand what a good sort of people they had met with, which had so much influence, that the next day towards the evening there appeared upon the riverside above 2,000 savages, who fell a-dancing as soon as they descried us. Thereupon our Autogamis went ashore, and after a short conference, some of the principal savages embarked on board of our canoes, and so we all steered to the chief village, which we did not reach till midnight. I ordered our huts to be made up on a point of land near a little river, at the distance of 1/4 of a league from the village. Though the savages pressed me extremely to lodge in one of their villages, yet none went with them but the Otogamis and the 4 Ottawas, who at the same time cautioned the savages not to approach to our camp in the night time. Next day I allowed my soldiers to refresh and rest themselves, and went myself to visit the grandees of this nation, to whom I gave presents of knives, scissors, needles, and tobacco. They gave me to understand that they were infinitely well pleased with our arrival in their country, for that they had heard the savages of other nations speak very honorably of the French. I took leave of them on the 12th, and set out with a convoy of 500 or 600 savages, who marched upon the shore, keeping pace with our canoes. We passed by another village that lay to the right hand, and stopped at a 3rd village that was 5 leagues distant from the first, but did not disembark, for all that I designed was to make a present to the leading men of the village, from whom I received more Indian corn and broiled or dried meat than I had occasion for. In fine, I passed from village to village without stopping, unless it were to encamp all night, or to present the savages with some trinkets, and so steered on to the last village, with a design to get some intelligence. As soon as we arrived at the end of this village, the great governor, who indeed was a venerable old gentleman, sent out hunters to bring us good cheer. He informed me that 60 leagues higher I should meet with the nation of the Essenaps, who waged war with him, that if it had not been for their being at war, he would have given me a convoy to their country, that however he meaned to give up to me 6 slaves of that country, which I might carry home and make use of as I saw occasion, and that in sailing up the river I had nothing to fear but the being surprised in the night time. In fine, after he had instructed me in several very useful circumstances, I immediately made everything ready for my departure. The commanders of this people acquainted me that they had 12 villages peopled by 20,000 warriors, that their number was much greater before the war, which they waged at one time with the Nadoneses, the Panimoba, and the Esanaps. The people are very civil, and so far from a wild savage temper that they have an air of humanity and sweetness. Their huts are long and round at the top, not unlike those of our savages, but they are made of reeds and bulrushes, interlaced and cemented with a sort of fat earth. Both the men and the women go naked all over, excepting their privities. The women are not so handsome as those who live upon the lakes of Canada. There seems to be something of government and subordination among these people, and they have their houses fortified with the branches of trees, and fascines strengthened with fat earth. The 21st, we embarked at the break of day, and landed that night in an island covered with stones and gravel, having passed by another at which I would not put in, because I would not slight the opportunity of the wind, which then stood very fair. Next day, the wind standing equally fair, we set out and continued our course all that day and the following night. For the 6th Esanaps informed us that the river was clean and free from rocks and beds of sand. The 23rd we landed early in the morning on the right side of the river, in order to careen one of our boats that sprung a leak. While that was a-doing, we dressed some venison that had been presented me by the commander of the last village of the Eokoros, and the adjacent country being replenished with woods, the savages of our company went a-shooting in the forests, but they saw nothing but small foals, that they did not think fit to shoot at. As soon as we re-embarked, the wind fell all of a sudden, and so we were forced to ply the oars. But most of the crew having slept but little the night before, they rowed but very faintly, which obliged me to put in at a great island 2 leagues higher. The 6 Esanapes slaves having informed me that this island afforded great plenty of hares, which I found to be true. These animals had a lucky instinct at taking shelter in this island, for there the woods are so thick that we were forced to set fire to several places before we could dislodge them. Having made an end of our game, my soldiers fed heartily, and thereupon fell so sound asleep that I could scarce get them waked upon a false alarm occasioned by a herd of wolves that made a noise among the thickets upon the continent. We re-embarked next day at 10 o'clock in the morning, and did not run above 12 leagues in 2 days, by reason that the savages of our company would needs walk along the riverside with their guns to shoot geese and ducks, in which they had very good success. After that, we encamped just by the mouth of a little river on the right hand, and the Esanap slaves gave me notice that the first of their villages was not above 16 or 18 leagues off. Upon this information, I sent, by the advice of the savages of our company, 2 of the slaves to give notice of our arrival. The 26th we rowed briskly, in hopes to reach the first village that day. But being retarded by the huge quantities of floating wood that we met in several places, we were forced to continue all night in our canoes. The 27th, about 10 or 11 o'clock, we approached to the village, and after putting up the great calumet of peace upon the prow of our canoes, lay upon our oars. Upon our first appearance, 300 or 400 Esanaps came running to the shore, and after dancing just over against us, invited us ashore. As soon as we came near the shore, they began to jump into our canoes, but I gave them to know by the 4 Esanap slaves that I desired they should retire, which they did immediately. Then I landed, being accompanied with the savages of our company, namely the Autocamis and the Ottawas, and with 20 soldiers. At the same time I gave orders to my sergeants to land and post sentries. As we stood upon the shore, all the Esanaps prostrated themselves 3 or 4 times before us, with their hands upon their foreheads, after which we were convoyed to the village with such acclamations of joy as perfectly stunned us. Upon our arrival at the gate, our conductors stopped us, till the governor, a man of 50 years of age, marched out with 500 or 600 men, armed with bows and arrows. The Otagamis of my company, perceiving this, charged them with insolence in receiving strangers with their arms about them, and called out, in the Eokoros language, that they ought to lay down their arms. But the Esanap slaves that I had sent in the day before came up to me, and gave me to understand that 'twas their custom to stand to their arms on such occasions, and that there was no danger in the case. However, the obstinate Outagamis obliged us to retire immediately to our canoes, upon which the leading officer and the whole battalion slung their bows and arrows aside all of a sudden. Then I returned, and our whole company entered the village with their fuses in their hands, which the savages admired mightily. The leader of the savages conducted us to a great hut, which looked as if nobody had lived in it before. When I and my 20 soldiers had entered the place, they stopped the Otagamis, affirming that they did not deserve the privilege of entering within the cottage of peace, since they had endeavored to create a difference and occasion a war between us and the Esanaps. In the meantime, I ordered my men to open the door and to call out the Otagamis, that they should offer no manner of injury. But the Otagamis, instead of coming in, pressed me to return with all expedition to the canoes, which accordingly I did, without loss of time, and carried with me the 4 Esanap slaves in order to leave them at the first village we came to. We had no sooner embarked that the 2 other slaves came to acquaint me that the governor would stop me in his river. But the Otagamis made answer that he could not do that without throwing a mountain into it. In fine, we did not stand to dispute the matter, and though 'twas then late, we rode straight to the next village, which lay about 3 leagues off. During the time of this passage, I used the precaution of taking from my 6 slaves an exact information of the constitution of their country, and particularly of the principal village. They having assured me that the capital canton was seated upon a sort of a lake, I took up a resolution of not stopping at the other villages, where I should only lose time and lavish my tobacco, and steering directly to the metropolitan in order to complain to their generalissimo. We arrived at the capital canton on the 3rd of November, and there met with a very honorable reception. The Otagamis of our company complained of the affront they had received, but the head general, being already informed of the matter, made answer that they ought to have carried off the governor or leading officer and brought him along with them. In passing from the first village to this, we run 50 leagues, and were followed by a procession of people that were much more sociable than the governor that offered us that affront. After our men had fitted up our huts at the distance of a cannon shot from the village, we went in a joint body with the Otagamis and the Ottawas to the cacique of that nation, and in the meantime the Esanap slaves were brought before him by 10 of my soldiers. I was actually in the presence of this petty king, when these slaves spent half an hour in prostrating themselves several times before him. I made him a present of tobacco, knives, needles, scissors, 2 firelocks with flints, some hooks, and a very pretty cutlass. He was better satisfied with these trifling things, which he had never seen before, than I could have been with a plentiful fortune. He testified his acknowledgement of the gift by a counter-present that was more solid, though not much more valuable, as consisting of peas, beans, hearts, roebucks, geese, and ducks, of which we sent great plenty to our camp. And indeed, we were extremely well satisfied with such a seasonable present. He gave me to know that since I designed to visit the Nasitares, he would give me a convoy of 200 or 300 men, that the Nasitares were a very honest sort of people, and that both they and his people were linked by a common interest in guarding off the Mozimblik, which were a turbulent and warlike nation. He added that the nation last mentioned were very numerous, that they never took the field without 20,000 men at least, that to repress the incursions and insults of that dangerous enemy, the Nasitares and his nation had maintained a confederacy for 26 years, and that his allies, the Nasitares, were forced to take up their habitation in islands where the enemy cannot reach them. I was glad to accept of his convoy and returned him many thanks. I asked 4 pirogues of him, which he granted very frankly, allowing me to pick and choose that number out of 50. Having thus concerted my measures, I was resolved to lose no time, and with that view ordered my carpenters to plane the pirogues, by which they were thinner and lighter by 1/2. The poor innocent people of this country could not conceive how we worked with an axe. Every stroke we gave they cried out, as if they had seen some new prodigy. Nay, the firing of pistols could not divert them from that amazement, though they were equally strangers both to the pistol and the axe. As soon as my pirogues were got ready, I left my canoes with the governor or prince and begged of him that they might remain untouched by anybody, in which point he was very faithful to me. I cannot but acquaint you in this place that the higher I went up the river, I met with more discretion from the savages. But in the meantime I must not take leave of the last village without giving some account of it. 'Tis bigger than all the rest, and is the residence of the great commander, or generalissimo, whose apartment is built by itself towards the side of the lake, and surrounded with 50 other apartments in which all his relations are lodged. When he walks, his way is strewed with the leaves of trees, but commonly he is carried by 6 slaves. His royal robes are of the same magnificence with those of the commander of the Ocoros, for he is naked all over excepting his lower parts, which are covered with a large scarf made of the barks of trees. The large extent of this village might justly entitle it to the name of a city. The houses are built almost like ovens, but they are large and high, and most of them are of reeds cemented with fat earth. The day before I left this place, I was walking about. I saw 30 or 40 women running at full speed, and being surprised with the spectacle, spoke to the Otagamis to order my 4 slaves to see what the matter was. For these slaves were my only interpreters in this unknown country. Accordingly, they brought me word that 'twas some new married women who were running to receive the soul of an old fellow that lay a-dying. From thence I concluded that the people were Pythagoreans, and upon that apprehension asked them how they came to eat animals, into which their souls might be transfused. But they made answer that the transmigration of souls is always confined to the respective species, so that the soul of a man cannot enter into a foal, as that of a foal cannot be lodged in a quadruped, and so on. The Ocoros of both sexes are fully as handsome and as clever as this people. December the 4th, I took leave of this village, having 10 soldiers on board of my pirogue, besides the 10 Aumamis, the 4 Ottawas, and the 4 Esenap slaves that I have mentioned so often. Here ended the credit and the authority of the Calumet of Peace, for the Nasitares are not acquainted with that symbol of concord. The first day we had enough to do to run 6 or 7 leagues by reason of the bulrushes with which the lake is encumbered. The 2 following days we sailed 20 leagues. The 4th day, a west-northwest wind surprised us with such a boisterous violence that we were forced to put ashore and lay 2 days upon a sandy ground, where we were in danger of starving for hunger and cold. For the country was so barren that we could not find a chip of wood wherewith to warm ourselves, or to dress our victuals. And as far as our eye could reach, there was nothing to be seen but fens covered with reeds and clay, and naked fields. Having endured this hardship, we set out again, and rowed to a little island, upon which we encamped, but found nothing there but green fields. However, to make some amends, we fished up great numbers of little trouts, upon which we fed very heartily. At last, after sailing 6 days more, we arrived at the point or land's end of that island which you see marked in my map with a flower de luz. 'Twas then the 19th day of December, and we had not yet felt all the rigorous hardships of the cold. As soon as I had landed and fitted up my tents or huts, I detached my Esenap slaves to the first of the 3 villages that lay before us, for I had avoided stopping at some villages in an island upon which we coasted in the night time. And the slaves returned in a great alarm, occasioned by the unfavorable answer they received from the Nasitares, who took us for Spaniards, and were angry with them for conducting us to their country. I shall not be minute in every particular that happened, for fear of tiring your patience. 'Tis sufficient to acquaint you that upon the report of my slaves, I immediately embarked and posted myself in another island that lay in the middle between the great island and the continent. But I did not suffer the Essenaps to be in my camp. In the meantime, the Nasitares sent expeditious couriers to the people that live 80 leagues to the southward of them, to desire they would send some of their number to examine us, for that people were supposed to be well acquainted with the Spaniards of New Mexico. The length of the journey did not discourage them, for they came as cheerfully as if it had been upon a national concern, and after taking a view of our clothes, our swords, our fuses, our air, complexion, and manner of speech, were forced to own that we were not true Spaniards. These considerations, joined to the account I gave them of the reasons upon which I undertook the voyage, of the war we were engaged in against Spain, and of the country to the eastward that we possessed, these, I say, had so much influence as to undeceive them. Then they invited me to encamp in their island, and brought me a sort of grain not unlike our lentils, that grows plentifully in that country. I thanked them for their invitation, and told them that I would not be obliged to distrust them, nor give them any occasion to distrust me. However, I crossed with my savages and 10 soldiers well armed, and after breaking the ice in certain places, for it had freezed hard for 10 or 12 days, I landed within 2 leagues of one of their villages, to which I walked up by land. 'Tis needless to mention the particulars of the ceremony with which I was received, it being the same with what I described upon other occasions. I shall only take occasion to acquaint you that my presence made a wonderful impression upon the minds of these people, whom I shall call a rascally rabble, though at the same time they are the politest nation I have yet seen in this country. Their governor bears the figure of a king more than any of the other commanders of the savages. He has an absolute dominion over all the villages which are described in my map. In this and the other islands I saw large parks or enclosures stocked with wild beeves for the use of the people. I had an interview for 2 hours together with the governor or the cacique, and almost our whole conference related to the Spaniards of New Mexico, who, as he assured me, were not distant from his country, above 80 tasu, each of which is 3 leagues. I must own, indeed, I was as curious upon this head as he was, and I wanted an account of the Spaniards from him, as much as he did from me. In fine, we reciprocally informed one another of a great many particulars relating to that head. He requested me to accept of a great house that was prepared for me, and his first piece of civility consisted in calling in a great many girls, and pressing me and my retinue to serve ourselves. Had this temptation been thrown in our way at a more seasonable time, it had proved irresistible, but 'twas not an agreeable mess for passengers that were enfeebled by labor and want. Sine serere, and bacio friget Venus. After he made us such a civil proffer, the savages, upon my instance, represented to him that my detachment expected me at a certain hour, and that if I stayed longer, they would be in pain for me. This adventure happened on the 7th of January. 2 days after, the cacique came to see me, and brought with him 400 of his own subjects, and 4 Missilimakinak savages, whom I took for Spaniards. My mistake was occasioned by the great difference between these 2 American nations, for the Missilimakinak savages were clothed, they had a thick bushy beard, and their hair hung down under their ears. Their complexion was swarthy, their address was civil and submissive, their mien grave, and their carriage engaging. Upon these considerations, I could not imagine that they were savages, though after all I found myself mistaken. These 4 slaves gave me a description of their country, which the Nasitares represented by way of a map upon a deer skin, as you see it drawn in this map. Their villages stand upon a river that springs out of a ridge of mountains, from which the long river likewise derives its source, there being a great many brooks there which by a joint confluence form the river. When the Nasitares have a mind to hunt wild beavies, they set out in pirogues, which they make use of till they come to the cross marked thus in the map, at the confluence of two little rivers. The hunting of the wild bulls, with which all the valleys are covered in summer, is sometimes the occasion of a cruel war, for the other cross, which you see in the map, is one of the boundaries or limits of the Missilimakinak, and if either of these two nations advances but a little beyond their limits, it gives rise to a bloody engagement. The mountains I spoke of but now are 6 leagues broad, and so high that one must cast an infinity of windings and turnings before he can cross them. Bears and wild beasts are their only inhabitants. The Missilimakinak nation is numerous and puissant. The 4 slaves of that country informed me that at the distance of 150 leagues from the place where I then was, their principal river empties itself into a salt lake of 300 leagues in circumference, the mouth of which is about 2 leagues broad, that the lower part of that river is adorned with 6 noble cities, surrounded with stone cemented with fat earth, that the houses of these cities have no roofs, but are open above like a platform, as you see them drawn in the map, that besides the above-mentioned cities, there were above 100 towns, great and small, round that sort of sea, upon which they navigate with such boats as you see drawn in the map, that the people of that country made stuffs, coppered axes, and several other manufactures, which the Otogamis and my other interpreters could not give me to understand, as being altogether unacquainted with such things, that their government was despotic, and lodged in the hands of one great head, to whom the rest paid a trembling submission, that the people upon that lake call themselves Taguglauk, and are as numerous as the leaves of trees. Such is the expression that the savages use for an hyperbole, that the Missilimakinak people supply the cities or town of the Taguglauk with great numbers of little calves, which they take upon the above-mentioned mountains, and that the Taguglauk make use of these calves for several ends, for they not only eat their flesh, but bring him up to labor, and make clothes, boots, etc. of their skins. They added that 'twas their misfortune to be took prisoners by the Nasitares in the war, which had lasted for 18 years, but that they hoped a peace would be speedily concluded upon which the prisoners would be exchanged, pursuant to the usual custom. They gloried in the possession of a greater measure of reason that the Nasitares could pretend to whom they allow no more than the figure of a man, for they look upon them as beasts otherwise. To my mind, their notion upon this head is not so very extravagant, for I observed so much honor and politeness in the conservation of these 4 slaves that I thought I had to do with Europeans. But, after all, I must confess that the Nasitares are the most tractable nation I met with among all the savages. One of the 4 Missilimakinak slaves had a reddish sort of a copper medal hanging upon his neck, the figure of which is represented in the map. I had it melted by Mr. de Ponti's gunsmith, who understood something of metals, but it became thereupon heavier and deeper colored, and withal somewhat tractable. I desired the slaves to give me a circumstantial account of these metals, and accordingly they gave me to understand that they are made by the Taguglauk, who are excellent artisans, and put a great value upon such metals. I could pump nothing farther out of them, with relation to the country, commerce, and customs of that remote nation. All they could say was that the great river of that nation runs all along westward, and that the salt lake into which it falls is 300 leagues in circumference and 30 in breadth. its mouth stretching a great way to the southward. I would fain have satisfied my curiosity in being an eyewitness of the manners and customs of the Tauglauk, but that being impractical, I was forced to be instructed at second hand by these Missilimakinak slaves, who assured me, upon the faith of a savage, that the Tauglauk wear their beards 2 fingers' breadth long, that their garments reach down to their knees, that they cover their heads with a sharp-pointed cap, that they always wear a long stick or cane in their hands, which is tipped not unlike what we use in Europe, that they wear a sort of boots upon their legs which reach up to the knee, that their women never shoe themselves, which perhaps proceeds from the same principle that prevails in Italy and Spain, and, in fine, that these people are always at war with the puissant nations that are seated in the neighborhood of the lake, but, withal, that they never disquiet the strolling nations that fall in their way by reason of their weakness, an admirable lesson for some princes in the world, who are so much intent upon the making use of the strongest hand. This was all I could gather upon that subject. My curiosity prompted me to desire a more particular account, but unluckily I wanted a good interpreter, and having to do with several persons that did not well understand themselves, I could make nothing of their incoherent fustian. I presented the poor miserable slaves with something in proportion to the custom of that country, and endeavored to persuade them to go with me to Canada, by making them such offers as in their esteem would appear like mountains of gold. But the love they had for their country stifled all persuasion. So true it is that nature reduced to its just limits cares but little for riches. In the meantime it began to thaw, and the wind chopped about to the southwest, upon which I gave notice to the great cacique of the Nasitares that I had a mind to return to Canada. Upon that occasion I repeated my presents, in compensation of which my pirogues were stowed with beef as full as they could hold. This done, I embarked and crossed over from the little island to the continent, where I fixed a great long pole, with the arms of France done upon a plair of lead. I set out the 26th of January, and arrived safe on the 5th of February in the country of the Essenaps. We had much more pleasure in sailing down the river than we had in going up, for we had the agreeable diversion of seeing several huntsmen shooting the waterfowl that are plentiful upon that river. You must know that the stream of the long river is all along very slack and easy, abating for about 3 leagues between the 14th and 15th village, for there indeed its current may be called rapid. The channel is so straight that it scarce winds at all from the head to the lake. 'Tis true, 'tis not very pleasant, for most of its banks have a dismal prospect, and the water itself has an ugly taste, but then its usefulness atones for such inconveniencies, for 'tis navigable with the greatest ease, and will bear barks of 50 ton, till you come to that place which is marked with a flower de luce in the map, and where I put up the post that my soldiers christened La Hontau's limit. March 2. I arrived in the Mississippi, which was then much deeper and more rapid than before, by reason of the rains and land floods. To save the labor of rowing, we then left our boats to the current, and arrived on the 10th in the island of Rencontre, which took its name from the defeat of 400 Iroquois, accomplished there by 300 Nadowesses. The story of the encounter is briefly this: a party of 400 Iroquois, having a mind to surprise a certain people in the neighborhood of the Otentas, of whom more anon, marched to the country of the Illinois, where they built canoes, and were furnished with provisions. After that, they embarked upon the river Mississippi, and were discovered by another little fleet that was sailing down the other side of the same river. The Iroquois crossed over immediately to that island, which is since called Aux Rencontres. The Nadowesses, i.e., the other little fleet, being suspicious of some ill design, without knowing what people they were, for they had no knowledge of the Iroquois, but by hearsay. Upon this suspicion, I say, they tugged hard to come up with them. The two armies posted themselves upon the point of the island where the two crosses are put down in the map, and as soon as the Nadoeses came in sight, the Iroquois cried out in the Illinois language, "Who are ye?" To which the Nadoeses answered, "Somebody," and putting the like question to the Iroquois, received the same answer. Then the Iroquois put this question to him, "Where are you a-going?" "To hunt beavies," replied the Nadoeses. "But pray," says the Nadoeses, "what's your business?" "To hunt men," replied the Iroquois. "'Tis well," says the Nadoeses, "we are men, and so you need go no farther." Upon this challenge the two parties disembarked, and the leader of the Nadoeses cut his canoes to pieces, and after representing to his warriors that they behoved either to conquer or die, marched up to the Iroquois, who received them at first onset with a cloud of arrows, but the Nadoeses, having stood their first discharge, which killed them 80 men, fell in upon them with their clubs in their hands, before the others could charge again, and so routed them entirely. This engagement lasted for 2 hours, and was so hot that 260 Iroquois fell upon the spot, and the rest were all taken prisoners. Some of the Iroquois indeed attempted to make their escape after the action was over, but the victorious general sent 10 or 12 of his men to pursue him in one of the canoes that he had taken, and accordingly they were all overtaken and drowned. The Nadoeses, having obtained this victory, cut off the noses and ears of 2 of the cleverest prisoners, and supplying them with fuses, powder, and ball, gave them the liberty of returning to their own country, in order to give their countrymen to understand that they ought not to employ women to hunt after men any longer. The 12th, we arrived at the village of the Otentas, where we took in a plentiful provision of turkey corn, of which these people have great store. They informed us that their river was pretty rapid, and took its rise from the neighboring mountains, and that the upper part of it was adorned with several villages inhabited by the people called Panimaha, Paneasa, and Panetonka. But considering that I was strained for time, and that I saw no probability of learning what I wanted to know with reference to the Spaniards, I took leave of them the next day, which was the 13th, and in 4 days' time, by the help of the current and our oars, made the river of the Missouris. This done, we run up against the stream of that river, which was at least as rapid as the Mississippi was at the time, and arrived on the 18th at the first village of the Missouris, where I only stopped to make the people some presents that procured me 100 turkeys, with which that people are wonderfully well stocked. After that, we rowed hard against the stream, and landed next night near the second village. As soon as I arrived, I detached a sergeant with 10 soldiers to convoy the Orogamis to the village, while the rest of my crew were busied in setting up our huts and unloading our canoes. It happened, unluckily, that neither the soldiers nor the Orogamis could make the savages understand them, and the latter were just ready to fall upon them, when an old fellow cried out that the strangers were not without more company, for that he had discovered our huts and canoes. Upon this, the soldiers and the Orogamis retired in a great consternation, and advised me to keep a strong guard all night. About 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 men approached to our little camp, and called in Illinois that they wanted an interview, upon which the Orogamis, being extremely well satisfied that there was somebody among them who could understand what they said, replied in Illinois that they should be very welcome as soon as the sun appeared in the horizon. Nevertheless, the Orogamis resented the former affront so much that they importuned me all night long to set fire to the village and put all the scoundrel inhabitants to the sword. I made answer to them that 'twas our business to be wiser than they, and to bend our thoughts, not upon a fruitless revenge, but upon the discovery that we were then in quest of, At the break of day, the two adventurers of the night came up to us, and after putting interrogatories to us for the space of 2 hours, invited us to come up to their village. The Autogamis replied that the head or governor of their nation ought to have saluted us sooner, and this obliged them to go back to give him notice. After that, we saw nobody for 3 hours, but at last, when our impatience was just beginning to boil, we perceived the governor, who accosted us in a trembling posture. He was accompanied with some of his own men, who were loaded with broiled or dried meat, sacks of turkey or Indian corn, dried raisins, and some speckled or party-colored buckskins. In consideration of this present, I made them another of less consequence. Then I brought on a conference between the Autogamis of my company and the 2 night messengers, in order to make some discovery of the nature of the country, but they still stopped their mouths with this answer, that they knew nothing of the matter, but that the other nations that lived higher up were able to inform us. Had I been of the same mind with the Autogamis, we had done noble exploits in this place, but I considered that 'twas my business to purchase the knowledge of several things, which I could not obtain by burning the village. To be short, we re-embarked the same day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and rowed about 4 leagues up the river, where we made the river of the Osage and encamped by its mouth. That night we had several false alarms from the wild Beavers, upon which we made sufficient reprisals afterwards. For the next day we killed many of them, notwithstanding that it rained so heavily that we could scarce stir out of our huts. Towards the evening, when the rain was over, and while we were transporting 2 or 3 of these Beavers to our little camp, we spied an army of the savages upon a full march towards us. Upon that, my men began to entrench themselves, and to unload their pieces with worms, in order to charge them afresh. But one of the pieces happening to go off, the whole body of the enemy disappeared, some straggling one way and some another, for these people were upon the same foot with the nations that live upon the long river, forasmuch as neither of them had ever seen or handled firearms. However, this adventure moved the Autogami so much that to satisfy them, I was obliged to re-embark that very night and return the same way that I came. Towards midnight, we came before a village and kept a profound silence till daybreak, at which time we rode up to their fort, and upon our entering there and discharging our pieces in the air, the women, children, and superannuated men were put into such a consternation that they run from place to place calling out for mercy. You must know, all their warriors were abroad, and 'twas a body of them that offered to attack us the day before. The Autogamis, perceiving the consternation of the women and children, called out that they behoved to depart the village, and that the women should have time to take up their children. Upon that, the whole crew turned out, and we set fire to the village on all sides. This done, we pursued our course down the rapid river, and entered the river Mississippi on the 25th, early in the morning. The 26th, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we descried 300 or 400 savages employed in the hunting of beavers, which swarmed in all the meads to the westward. As soon as the hunters spied us, they made a sign that we should make towards them. Being ignorant who or how numerous they were, we made a halt at first, but at last we put in about a musket shot above them, calling out to them that they should not approach to us in a body. Upon that, 4 of their number came up to us with a smiling countenance, and gave us to know, in the Illinois language, that they were Arkansas. We could not but credit their report, for they had knives and scissors hanging upon their necks, and little axes about them, which the Illinois presented them with when they meet. In fine, being assured that they were of that nation, which Mr. de la Salle and several other Frenchmen were intimately acquainted with, we landed at the same place, and they entertained us first with dancing and singing, and then with all sorts of meat. The next day they showed us a crocodile that they had knocked in the head 2 days before, by a stratagem that you'll find described in another place. After that, they gave us the diversion of a hunting match, for it is customary with them, when they mean to divert themselves, to catch the Beavers by the different methods laid down in this cut. I put some questions to them relating to the Spaniards, but they could not resolve them. All that I learned from them was that the Missouris and the Osage are numerous and mischievous nations, equally void both of courage and honesty, that their countries were watered with very great rivers, and, in a word, were too good for them. After we had spent 2 days with them, we pursued our voyage to the river Awabash, taking care to watch the crocodiles very narrowly, of which they had told us incredible stories. The next day, we entered the mouth of that river, and founded it to try the truth of what the savages reported of its depth. In effect, we found there 3 fathom and a half water, but the savages of our company alleged that 'twas more swelled than usually. They all agreed that 'twas navigable 100 leagues up, and I wished heartily that my time had allowed me to run up to its source, but that being unseasonable, I sailed up against the stream till we came to the river of the Illinois, which we made on the 9th of April with some difficulty, for the wind was against us the first 2 days, and the current was very rapid. All I can say of the river Mississippi, now that I am to take leave of it, is that its narrowest part is half a league over, and the shallowest is a fathom and a half deep, and that according to the information of the savages, its stream is pretty gentle for 7 or 8 months of the year. As for shelves or banks of sand, I met with none in it. 'Tis full of isles, which look like groves, by reason of the great plenty of trees, and in the verdant season of the year afford a very agreeable prospect. Its banks are woods, meadows, and hills. I cannot be positive whether it winds much in other places, but as far as I could see, its course is very different from that of our rivers in France, for I must tell you by the way, that all the rivers of America run pretty straight. The river of the Illinois is entitled to riches, by virtue of the benign climate and of the great quantities of deer, roebucks, and turkeys that feed upon its brinks, not to mention several other beasts and fowls, a description of which would require an entire volume. If you saw but my journal, you would be sick of the tedious particulars of our daily adventures, both in hunting and fishing diverse species of animals, and in rencounters with the savages. In short, the last thing I shall mention of this river is that the banks are replenished with an infinity of fruit trees, which we saw in a dismal condition, as being stripped of their verdure, and that among these fruit trees there are many vines, which bear most beautiful clusters of very large grapes. I ate some of these grapes dried in the sun, which had a most delicious taste. The beavers are as unfrequent in this as in the Long River, where I saw nothing but otters, of which the people make furs for the winter. I set out from the Illinois River on the 10th of April, and by the help of a west-southwest wind, arrived in 6 days at the fort of Crevecoeur, where I met Mr. de Tonty, who received me with all imaginable civility, and is justly respected and honored by the Iroquois. I stayed 3 days in this fort, where there were 30 coureurs de bois that traded with the Illinois. The 20th, I arrived at the village of the Illinois, and to lessen the drudgery of a great land carriage of 12 great leagues, engaged 400 men to transport our baggage, which they did in the space of 4 days, being encouraged by a bribe of a great roll of Brazil tobacco, and 100-pound weight of powder, 200 weight of ball, and some arms, which I gave to the most considerable men of their number. The 24th, I arrived at Checaco, where my Autogamis took leave of me in order to return to their own country, being very well satisfied with a present I'd made them of some fuses and some pistols. The 25th, I re-embarked, and by rowing hard in a calm, made the river of the Mummies on the 28th. There I met 400 warriors, upon the very same place where Mr. de la Salle had formerly built a fort. These warriors were then employed in burning 3 Iroquois, who, as they said, deserved the punishment, and invited us to share in the pleasure of the show, for the savages take it very ill if one refuses the diversion of such real tragedies. The tragical spectacle made me shrink, for the poor wretches were put to inconceivable torture, and upon that I resolved to re-embark with all expedition, alleging for an apology that my men had great store of brandy with them, and would certainly make themselves drunk in solemnifying their victory, upon which they would be apt to commit disorders that I could not possibly prevent. Accordingly, I went immediately on board, and after coasting along the lake, crossed the Bay de Lourdes, and landed at Missilimakinak the 22nd. I am informed by the Sieur de S. Pierre de Repentigny, who travelled from Quebec hither upon the ice, that Mr. de Denonville has took up a resolution of making a peace with the Iroquois, in which he means to comprehend the other nations that are his allies, and with that view had given notice to his allies that they should not infest the Iroquois. He acquaints me further that Mr. de Denonville has sent orders to the governor of this place to persuade the Rat, one of the commanders of the Hurons, to go down to the colony with a design to have him hanged, and that the savage general, being aware of the design, has made a public declaration that he will go thither on purpose to defy him. Accordingly, he designs to set out tomorrow with a great body of Ottawas and some coureurs de bois under the command of Mr. Dolhut. As for the soldiers of my detachment, I have dispersed them in several canoes among the savages and the coureurs de bois, but having some business to adjust in this place, I am obliged to tarry myself 7 or 8 days longer. This, sir, is a true account of my little voyage. I have related nothing but the essential circumstances, choosing to overlook the rest, which are so trifling as to be unworthy of your curiosity. As for the Illinois Lake, 'tis 300 leagues in circumference, as you may see by the scale of leagues upon the map. 'Tis seated in an admirable climate. Its banks are clothed with fine and tall trees, and have but few meads. The river of the Mummies is not worth your regard. The Bay de Lourdes Quidort is of an indifferent large extent, and receives the river upon which the Ottawas are wont to hunt beavers every 3rd year. In short, it has neither shelves, rocks, nor banks of sand. The land which bounds it on the south side is replenished with roebucks, deer, and turkeys. Farewell, good sir, and assure yourself that 'twill always be a sensible pleasure to me to amuse you with an account of the greatest curiosities I meet with. But now, sir, I hope you will not take it ill that the relation I here give you is only an abridgment of my voyage. For, in earnest, to be minute upon every particular curiosity would require more time and leisure than I can spare. I have here sent you a view of the substantial part, and shall afterwards hope for an opportunity of recounting to you by word of mouth an infinity of adventures, rencounters, and observations, which may call up the reflecting faculty of thinking men. My own thought is too superficial to philosophize upon the origin, the belief, the manners, and customs of so many savages, or to make any advances with reference to the extent of this continent to the westward. I have contented myself with offering some thoughts upon the causes of the bad success of the discoveries that several experienced men have attempted in America, both by sea and land, and I flatter myself that my thoughts upon that head are just. The fresh instances of Mr. de la Salle and several other unlucky discoverers may afford a sufficient and seasonable caution to those who for the future shall undertake to discover all the unknown countries of this new world. 'Tis not even one that's qualified for such an enterprise. non licet omnibus adire Corinthum. 'Twere an easy matter to trace the utmost limits of the country that lies to the west of Canada, provided it to be gone about in a proper method. In the first place, instead of canoes, I would have such adventurers to make use of certain sloops of a particular structure, which might draw but little water, and be portable, as being made of light wood, and withal carry 13 men, with 35 or 40 hundredweight of stowage, and be able to bear the shock of the waves in the great lakes. Courage, health, and vigilance are not sufficient of themselves to qualify a man for such adventures. He ought to be possessed of other talents, which are rarely met with in one and the same person. The conduct of the 300 men that accompanied me upon this discovery gave me a great deal of trouble. It requires a large stock of industry and patience to keep such a company up to their duty. Sedition, mutinies, quarrels, and an infinity of disorders frequently take place among those who, being in remote and solitary places, think they have a right of using force against their superiors. One must dissemble, and even shut his eyes upon occasion, lest the growing evil should be inflamed. The gentlest methods are the surest, for him that commands in chief, and if any mutiny or seditious plot is in view, 'tis the business of the inferior officers to stifle it, by persuading the mutineers that the discovery of such things to the commanding officer would create a great deal of uneasiness. So, the chief officer must still make as if he were ignorant of what passes, unless it be that the flame breaks out in his presence. Then indeed he lies under an indispensable obligation of inflicting speedy and private punishment, without his prudence directs him to put off the execution upon an apprehension of some pernicious consequences that may ensue thereupon. In such voyages he must overlook 1,000 things, which upon other occasions he has all reason to punish. He must counterfeit a downright ignorance of their intrigues with the she-savages, of their quarrels among themselves, of their negligence in not mounting the guard, and not observing the other points of duty. In a word, he must pretend to know nothing of an infinity of such disorders, as have no direct tendency to a revolt. He ought to use the precaution of singling out a spy in his little army and reward him handsomely for a dexterous intelligence as to all that happens, to the end that he may remedy the growing disorders either directly or indirectly. The spy may, by good management and due secrecy, find out the ringleader of a club or cabal, and when the commanding officer has received such satisfaction upon the matter, that there's no room left to doubt of the criminal's demerit, 'twill then be very convenient to make away with him, and that with such management that nobody should know what became of him. Farther, he ought to give 'em tobacco and brandy now and then, to ask their advice upon some occasions, to fatigue 'em as little as possible, to call them up to dance and make merry, and at the same time to exhort them to live in a good understanding with one another. The best topic he can make use of for enforcing their duty is religion, and the honor of their country, and this he ought to descant upon himself. For though I have a great deal of faith in the power of the clergy, yet I know that sort of men does more harm than good in voyages of this nature, and for that reason I choose to be without their company. The person who undertakes to go upon a discovery ought to be very nice and cautious in the choice of his men, for every one is not fit for his business. His men ought to be between 30 and 40 years of age, of a dry constitution, of a peaceable temper, of an active and bold spirit, and inured to the fatigues of voyages. The whole retinue must consist of 300 men, and of that number there must be some ship carpenters, gunsmiths, and sawyers, with all their tools, besides huntsmen and fishermen, with their tackling. You must likewise have surgeons among them, but their chest ought to contain nothing but razors, lancets, external medicines for wounds, Orvietan, and Senna. All the men of the detachment ought to be provided with buff coats and boots to turn the arrows, for, as I intimated above, the savages of the unknown countries are strangers to firearms. They must be armed with a double-barreled gun, a double-barreled pistol, and a good longsword. The commanding officer must take care to provide a sufficient quantity of the skins of deer, elks, and beavies, in order to be sawed together and hung round his camps upon certain stakes fixed at convenient distances from one another. I had as many as would go round a square of 30 foot every way. For each skin being 5 foot deep and almost 4 foot broad, I made 2 pieces of 8 skins apiece, which were raised and extended in a minute. Besides these, he ought to carry with him some pot guns of 8 foot in length and 6 in breadth, with 2 hand mills for grinding the Indian corn, nails of all sizes, pickaxes, spades, hatchets, hooks, soap, and cotton to make candles of. Above all, he must not forget to take in good store of powder, brandy, Brazil tobacco, and such things as he must present to the savages whose country he discovers. Add to this cargo an astrolabe, a semicircle, several sea compasses, some simple and some of variation, a lodestone, 2 large watches of 3 inches diameter, pencils, colors, and paper for making journals and maps for the designing of land creatures, fowl, fish, trees, plants, grain, and, in a word, whatever seems worthy of his curiosity. I would likewise advise him to carry with him some trumpeters and fiddlers, both for animating his retinue and raising the admiration of the savages. With this equipage, sir, a man of sense, conduct, and action, I mean, a man that's vigilant, prudent, cautious, and above all, patient and moderate, and qualified for contriving expedients upon all occasions. A man, I say, thus qualified and thus fitted out may boldly go to all the countries that lie to the west of Canada, without any apprehension of danger. As for my own part, I seriously declare that if I were possessed of all these qualities, I should esteem in my happiness to be employed upon such an enterprise, both for the glory of His Majesty and my own satisfaction. For the continued diversity of objects did so charm me in my voyages, that I had scarce time to reflect upon the fatigue and trouble that I underwent. I am, sir, yours, etc.